Professor Hagger is John Curtin Distinguished Professor and founding Director of the Health, Psychology and Behavioral Medicine Research Group in the School of Psychology, Curtin University, Westphalia, Finland. He's also Editor-in-Chief of Health Psychology Review and Stress and Health and editorial board member of 10 other international peer-reviewed journals. His research focuses on the social processes involved in the self-regulation of health behavior, and it applies and integrates social, cognitive, and motivational theories to understand and to intervene in and change a range of health behaviors. Today is talking about the importance of self-control in determining behavior. Theory, practice, mechanisms, and implications for practice. Please welcome Professor Hagger.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you today. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk at this symposium. So yes, my name is Martin Hagger. I'm a health psychologist. I'm interested in the factors that influence people's health behavior. And when I talk about health behaviors, I mean the kinds of things we do that can promote health. So that can be anything from doing more exercise, drinking less coffee, eating healthily, and of course things like taking medication or adhering to rehabilitation exercises that a medic or a health practitioner gives to us. So one particular area I'm interested in is this notion of self-control. And I'm going to introduce the idea of self-control to you and talk a little bit about one idea, or one perspective on self-control that has become very popular, this idea called ego depletion. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about the theory of ego depletion, and then I'll talk a little bit about ego depletion in the real world, because I think in terms of practice, that's where it's going to have the most impact. And I'll talk also a little bit about how we can use ideas about self-control to make therapies and behavior change better. So I think it fits in well with this symposium on change. So what is self-control? Well, it's central to goal-directed behavior. So it's about achieving long-term goals and putting aside the short-term things that make us, that might be more attractive, that might be more appealing, in favor of pursuing a long-term goal. So it could be like, for example, losing weight. It could be studying for an exam. It could be, getting the job that you want. Those kinds of things. So long-term goals in favor over short-term gratification. And it's about the capacity to actively engage in persistent, distant behavior to obtain those sorts of distant goals. And it's about foregoing those short-term gains in terms of those favorable long-term goals. And it reflects a person's capacity or ability to override impulses, to resist temptations, to break habits, and what psychologists call going against that dominant response. What is the easiest thing to do? And if you think about many of the things in our everyday life, they tend to be queued up, they tend to be prompted by things in our environments. And those things tend to appeal to our senses. And marketing companies are very good at this. So, the location of the tasty snacks are always by the checkout in the supermarket, those kinds of things. So why is self-control important? Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, there is just a
strange. Yeah, I can't hear it, but how's that?
It's roughly. Okay.
Oh, you mean the hubbing? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, if it doesn't disturb it.
Sure, people can cope. They can exercise self-control. So why is self-control important? Well, the behaviors that people should engage in or shouldn't engage in are associated with these kinds of maladaptive or problematic outcomes that we see in our society. So there's quite a few sort of health-related ones there, but they're also associated with outcomes, consequences that are that also go beyond health-related outcomes. So things like, personal debt, gambling problems, crime, all of these may be in some way linked or associated with self-control. And there's good evidence demonstrating that. But it's not all bad news. So good self-control is associated with many adaptive outcomes in society. So success in the workplace, cohesive personal relationships, good health, capacity to cope with difficulties, personal problems, and of course reduced susceptibility for maladaptive social ills like crime, drug abuse, and so on. So what does the research evidence and theory say about self-control? Well, most of the theories that have looked at self-control and tried to understand its impact on behavior, have focused on self-control as an individual difference, as a disposition. So one of the more famous perspectives, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, is Walter Mischel's delaying gratification concept. And this is the idea that a person's capacity to delay short-term gains in favor of long-term, larger, more meaningful gains is very adaptive. And he made this distinction between, him and his co-workers made this distinction between sort of hot and cool processes that determine our behavior. And the hot processes tend to be these more sort of emotive, spontaneous, low effort, very quick, rapid processes that lead to doing a behavior. And so it has this sort of, if it feels good, do it kind of a notion to it. And that's juxtaposed with this more cool process, which is much more reflective, much more deliberative, but more effortful and slow. And good self-control is often associated with the capacity of this cool process putting the brakes on the more sort of hot processes. So overcoming those more spontaneous, low-effort processes. And the reason why people might have better capacity, better self-control than others, is due to perhaps a capacity to better organize and structure their long-term goals, and also to recognize and predict the potential benefits, the cost and the consequences of their actions and their behavior. So that's from a very influential theory of crime by Goffin and Hershey. So that's some of the sort of individual difference or trait perspectives on self-control. A recent perspective that has gained a lot of traction in the area of social psychology and other areas is this so-called notion of ego depletion. And this stems from a strength or resource depletion model of self-control. And the idea is that people have enough self-control to engage in these kinds of behaviors that result in these long-term gains, but it's only limited. And so this resource, if you like, becomes depleted after a period of doing behaviors that require self-control. And so the suggestion is that engaging in an act of self-control results in reduced performance on subsequent acts of self-control. And this is very much more a state perspective, particularly sort of the demands of tasks and the demands of the environment on people's resources. And that state of reduced self-control capacity, or failure, is termed ego depletion. And it's become an extremely popular and influential perspective, mainly because I think it chimes quite well with our everyday experiences. So for example, if you had a long day doing menial tasks that you have to resist the temptation to quit or do other more enjoyable things, then you feel tired. You feel physically, but also mentally or cognitively fatigued. And that's very similar to this notion of ego depletion. And so the predictions of this sort of model is that self-control is a finite resource that becomes depleted after a period of exertion, and it means that your capacity for self-control is reduced if you are required to do other tasks or behaviors or activities that require you to resist temptations, break habits, those kinds of things. Interestingly, it can also be restored, or the notion of this strength or this capacity suggests that it can also be restored, perhaps after a period of rest or recuperation. Now, typically, this model, this theory, this idea of ego depletion has been tested using what they call a sequential task paradigm. Okay? Sounds very complicated, but actually it's very simple. So it's a laboratory experiment where individuals are introduced to a task and they're randomly assigned to either an experimental group or a control group. And the experimental group they receive a task and they're required to do a task that requires self-control. So it requires them to resist impulses or to break some sort of habit. And the people in the control group do a similar task, but it doesn't have that demanding perspective. It doesn't require them to control their impulses as much. And then all of the participants do a second task, and this task usually lasts around sort of 5 or 10 minutes. And then all of the participants do a second task, and it's the same task for both sets of participants this time. It's usually a different task, but it has the same demands. And this one requires self-control for all participants. And to the extent that people who receive the first task, their performance is reduced in that second self-control task, compared to the control participants, we have evidence or confirmation of the ego depletion effect. So the idea is that these people, because they're required to do self-control in this task, their reserves of self-control are reduced. It leaves them with less reserves to do the second task, whereas these people don't have that deficit. So what am I talking about when I talk about self-control, tasks, and behaviors? Well, I've sort of intimated some of these behaviors before. Particularly, you can infer those from some of the consequences of poor self-control that I outlined to you earlier. So it could be things like eating tasty or unhealthy food, smoking and drinking alcohol, compulsive spending, effortful decision-making, and engaging in physical activity or exercise. All of those behaviors, either doing them or refraining from them, respectively requires self-control. So there's self-controlled behaviors in everyday life. In the lab, it's less easy to try to test ego depletion using these kinds of tasks. So social psychologists come up with ingenious ways of testing it in a confined space. So they have tasks that require controlling impulses, controlling thoughts, controlling emotions, making choices. And so one of the famous impulse-related tasks was conducted by Roy Baumeister, who's the instigator of this notion of ego depletion. And what he did was he put people in a lab, and those people in the experimental condition were told to try a very tasty food. We're told to try a very bland food. So these are chopped radishes. And they were also presented with these very tempting food, very tasty food, chocolate chip cookies. And they constructed the lab so that the lab was filled with the aroma of these chocolate chip cookies. Okay? But they were told that they were not allowed to taste the cookies, they had to resist them. And they were told to taste the radishes, the raw radishes. Somewhat bland food, less appealing. Okay? Now, participants in the control group, they were told, you could try either of these foods. Okay, you can try either the radishes or the cookies. Guess which one they chose? And the idea was that people who were in the radishes condition, the experimental condition, would be required to resist the temptation of eating the cookies in favor of eating the radishes. And that would reduce their self-control resources and leave them ego-depleted. And sure enough, when the participants did another task that required self-control, this was a difficult figure tracing task, a puzzle, they performed much worse than the people who were in the cookies condition. So it gave initial evidence for this idea of self-control, ego depletion. Subsequent experiments have used controlling thoughts tasks. So this is a controlling thoughts experiment. In these experiments, people are given a thought and told to suppress it, right? So the way they do that is using Daniel Wegner's ironic rebound effect experiment. So he basically said to people, don't think of a white bear. As soon as I said that, what do you think of? White bear. Okay. Also, there's a picture of a white bear there. And suppressing those thoughts requires self-control. So, and then people in the control condition were not told to suppress the thought. Other experiments have presented people with amusing videos or very emotionally aversive videos, upsetting videos, and asked them not to express any facial expressions of emotion, and that suppression requires self-control, compared to the control group who are freely able to express their emotions. And then there are tasks that require controlling choices, particularly with uninformed choices, those kinds of things. So that's how we test ego depletion in the laboratory. There are also some adjunct hypotheses in this idea, this notion. The idea is that people will conserve their self-control resources. So if they know that they've got lots of tasks ahead, particularly ones that are reversive, they'll keep hold of their resources. So that will actually result in a reduction in their performance on initial tasks. There's also a training hypothesis, and this is very much related to interventions. So if people have practice and then some recovery on self-control tasks over a period of days or even weeks, they get better at these kinds of tasks. And I'll get onto that a little bit later. So we were very interested in this idea, and like I said, the notion of ego depletion has become extremely popular in the literature. And this resulted in nowadays is over 500 experiments on ego depletion. So we, back in 2010, we conducted a meta-analysis with just a synthesis, an averaging out, correcting for methodological errors and artifacts, of the ego depletion effect of all the experiments using this experimental paradigm, just to see what the strength of the effect was. And these are the results. So we found that performing a self-controlled task had an impact on task performance, okay? And that impact was 0.62 was the effect size. And that's a medium-sized effect. It means that the effect is there and it's quite robust. We also demonstrated that resource depletion, so performing those self-controlled tasks, resulted in greater effort, perceived effort, greater perceived task difficulty, and greater fatigue, which is very much consistent with this notion of ego depletion. So people who do these self-controlled tasks feel more tired, they feel that they're increasing their effort, and they feel that the task is more difficult. Now, as I mentioned earlier, training may facilitate self-control. So if people engage persistently over a period of days or weeks on tasks like using their non-dominant hand, so it requires self-control not to use your dominant hand, doing computerized tasks like the Stroop task, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that. So that's resisting the temptation to name a word, which is presented in a colour, in favour of naming the colour, which is the purpose of the task. And then even research looking at people using strong mouthwash, Listerine, you put it in your mouth and you swish it around for about 30 seconds, brings tears to your eyes. It's very, very powerful. And actually, that requires self-control, for you not to spit it out. So all of these tasks, doing them persistently over a period of time, results in improved performance. And we showed that in our meta-analysis. And subsequent meta-analyses also demonstrated quite strong effects for these kinds of training. And the reason why the training seems to be so strong is that people tend to learn quite well to inhibit their responses. So this is the idea of practicing capacity for inhibition. And this also points to a very important aspect, is that ego depletion, or this notion of ego depletion, self-control, is perhaps domain neutral. In other words, it's a capacity that is effective or influences performance on lots of different tasks, lots of different behaviors. Now, there are alternative perspectives on ego depletion. So a lot of theorists suggest that maybe this sort of mythical resource isn't really a good way of explaining self-control, and actually it might be results of a more cognitive process, a more mental process, more relating to motivation. And certainly opportunity cost models and motivation and attentional models demonstrate that the deficits that people experience, the problems that people experience when it comes to, after performing tasks that require self-control, is about deficits in executive functioning and this sort of mechanistic idea of resource depletion. And so here's an example of one of those theories or one of those models. So, self-control at time one results in people shifting in their motivation to actually do the task, right? And so people become less motivated as they fatigue. They become less motivated, and they become less motivated to exert control and more motivated to act on impulse. It becomes more attractive to act on impulse rather than to exert effortful control. And there's also this notion, the idea is that people's attention shifts as they get more tired, more cognitively tired. So they shift away from cues that signal control towards cues that signal impulse-related or habitual or reward-related behaviors. And that leads to this self-control failure. And it's really about people weighing up whether the benefits of persisting with the task outweigh the costs of doing it. There's also some interesting research demonstrating that actually it's not really about, or less about, people's capacity, but it's more about their beliefs in self-control. And Veronica Jobe and various others have demonstrated that believing that self-control is limited or unlimited affects their ego depletion, affects their self-control. And they've demonstrated that people who engage in a self-control task and they believe that their self-control is unlimited, they don't experience subsequent performance drop-off in a subsequent task. So here's some data from Joe and co-workers' study. These are performance on the self-control task. This is a Stroop task. In a non-depleting or a depleting condition, so that's easy Stroop task, hard Stroop task, and they demonstrated that actually people with a non-limited or an unlimited view of self-control perform much more effectively, particularly when they were depleted on the subsequent Stroop task. There's also some controversy as to whether ego depletion is a real effect, and some clever reanalyses, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but some clever reanalyses of our original meta-analysis data suggested that actually there was a lot of studies that showed unrealistically high effects compared to the size of the study. And they suggested this was a demonstration of publication bias. And in some respects, this is a microcosm of some of the problems that we're experiencing within the discipline of psychology and science more general. The problem of replication. And actually what people are finding is that actually there's quite a lot of research which we thought was very robust, but actually isn't. And this is down to, one of the problems could be that journal editors favor very strong, very unique findings. And actually they are likely or maybe due to chance, and they may be due to bias from the labs that conducted that research. And so what you actually see is a very biased picture of the true literature. And actually what's really happening is that perhaps there's lots of other studies which show very different effects that haven't been published. Okay? And so actually a lot of the null findings, or the findings that show smaller effects for phenomena like ego depletion, have been suppressed in the literature. Okay? And so things are changing a little bit because of this kind of research. But it's controversial. Anyway, applying these additional correction statistics to our original meta-analysis demonstrated that the effect might be much smaller than we originally estimated. Actually, it might even be close to zero. So subsequent studies have demonstrated a big range of ego depletion effects, different studies. New meta-analyses have shown smaller effects than our original one, and a lot of the studies seem to demonstrate that the effect is smaller, and some suggest when correcting for publication bias that it might even be zero, or no different from zero. So that really threw the cat amongst the pigeons, and what we did was we conducted this multi-lab registered replication report, which is basically just performing an ego depletion experiment in lots of different labs, so that we get a very big sample that is much closer to the population in terms of size, and the paradigm, the methods are very similar across different labs. Okay. And this is what's the word? Initiative conducted or proposed by Perspectives on Psychological Science, the journal of the APS. And so we conducted this ego depletion registered replication report. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. Suffice to say that we had two tasks, and they were both computer administered. One of the tasks was very similar to what's a task that's been conducted in the literature in the past, crossing out E's according to very difficult or very easy instructions. And then this interference task, which is very much related to response inhibition, very much like the Stroop task. And so 24 labs did the same protocol over a period of a few months and submitted their results to us, and then we conducted a meta-analysis of these experiments. And these are the results. I'm not going to go into each different lab. These are the different labs' results, and you can see the dotted line in the middle there is 0. Okay, that's a null effect. And you can see that the tails of each lab, the effect of each lab, demonstrated that actually this is a null effect, that we found 0 effect. And you can see, if we put that on our map of ego depletion, you can see that we're now the proud owners of the largest and the smallest effect size for ego depletion. This has subsequently been confirmed by another replication effort conducted by Vos and Baumeister, and just recently reported this year at the SPSP conference in Atlanta. And so it seems that there are issues relating to ego depletion. So, just to finish up, my hunch is, where do we go now for this notion of ego depletion? If there are these questions around its whether it's a real effect, whether there is bias in the effect, and so forth. Well, one area that has borne fruit is looking at ego depletion in real-world contexts. And I'll just leave you with a couple of little experiments that we did looking at ego depletion and its impact on health behaviors. So the first study I'm going to present to you is looking at the effects of ego depletion in people who have issues or problems with controlling their body weight. And so what we did is we had people with elevated or normal body mass index, okay, and we assumed that they would have high and low dietary restraint. So people with high body mass index would have problems with restraining their eating behavior, but they would be motivated to restrain their eating. And we suggested that people who were more ego depleted would eat more food when depleted. So in other words, self-control is implicated in trying to control eating behavior. So we actually had a student sample with elevated and normal BMI. We had a depletion condition, where people engaged in a depletion task or a no depletion task, and then of course we had these high and low BMI groups. And our depletion task was a difficult counting coordination task, and they had easy and hard versions. And what we did was they engaged in this counting task, and then we said the experiment was over, and we offered them the opportunity to engage in a second experiment, which they all agreed to do. And we said that this was a taste and rate task. So we asked them to taste some foods, and these were cookies and Smarties. So they had to taste them, and then they had to rate how much they liked the food, what it tasted like, what its texture was like, those kinds of things. But actually it was a sham. Of course it was a part of the same experiment. What we were really interested in was how much food they ate. And sure enough, we found that participants in the control condition more or less ate the same amount of food, regardless of whether they had high or low BMI. But as you can see, participants in the high BMI, both for the Smarties and the cookies condition, ate much more. So that's this point here. So they had high BMI Smarties, this point there, and the high BMI cookies, this point there, ate substantially more than people in the low BMI. So it suggests that people with high BMI who have issues with their self-control are very vulnerable to self-control. And so what we need to do is intervene to strengthen their self-control resources, or structure their environment so as to reduce their self-control. I think I'm probably running a little bit over time here, so what I'll do is I'll stop there. And if people want to ask questions, they can do so. So thank you very much.